Hi, this is Professor Brad Jones. If you're watching this video, that means you probably participated in a survey for extra credit that was just closed out yesterday. So you would have taken it in the past week. This video serves as what's known as a debrief, that is to describe to you what it is that you were doing or might have been doing, as well as what the research expectations were underlying the survey. Let me share my screen. Okay, so what you did is you took an online survey, but really what you did is participate in an online survey experiment. And this study deals with the issues of gender, violence, and deportation. I haven't come up with a fancy title for the project yet, but this is just a work in progress. All right, now let's motivate this thing. Here's a definition of migration that I like. Migration is determined by economic and social factors around the world, by hotspots of violence that periodically explode, and most of all, by the increasingly complex web of family ties that exist between states. Deportation is the state. And so this study seeks to understand attitudes about deportation, support for deportation, and blame for why deportations actually take place. And in the context of this, we've put together what's known as a survey experiment, which I'll describe in much more detail in a few minutes. But we had three research objectives here behind this survey. And the first is this: does contextualizing information about why migrants come to the US in the first place impact judgment, that is, attitudes? The second, does gender of the deportee affect attitudes about deportation? And lastly, third, does learning about what happens to a deportee after his or her removal help shape opinion about deportation? Why should we care? Well, among many reasons we should care, because deportation is a frequently used policy tool by the US government. And so what you see on the left side of the screen here, the total number of removals from 1892 to 2019, 1892 is when we first started recording these things. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you see the period between 2000 and the present blown up. And in total, the US has formally removed about 8.7 million individuals, but 70% of that 8.7 million has occurred since 2001, well within most of your lifetimes. And to put that into context, the total number of removals since 2001 is roughly the size of the country of El Salvador. But there's more. So formal removals, what we think of as formal deportation, is not the only way that individuals are removed. There's something that's known as voluntary returns, which essentially is you're asked to return because you're told you have a order of removal. And so many voluntarily return because they don't want to have to go through proceedings that lead to a formal deportation. And so if we add together the total number of formal removals, which we saw on the previous slide, to the voluntary returns, we have a staggeringly large number of about 57.3 million. And since 2001, that number is about 10.9 million. So in the chart here, the light gray corresponds to voluntary returns. The black dots correspond to formal removals. And again, to put that 10.9 million into context, that's roughly the size of the current population of Cuba. Okay, so let's motivate this and then help to understand why it is that I conducted this survey and what it is that you contributed to it. Let's do a one question thought exercise. I like to do this. Let's ask this question. If we ask Americans why they think people attempt to enter the US, what answer do you think we get? Think about that for a minute. Why do people attempt to enter, maybe unlawfully, the US? Well, the fact is, we probably get a whole bunch of answers, a whole bunch of reasons for that. But here's the problem. The problem is that we're not often prompted to even think about this question. For most individuals, for most Americans, deportation which occurs frequently, is a not frequently thought about issue. Yet, given the prevalence of deportations, it's useful for us to think more deeply about the reasons why immigrants may choose to enter extra legally into the United States. So my research study asked several questions. And the first question is, suppose that we contextualized migration. That is, we described the reasons why an immigrant might leave his or her country. In our study, we contextualize it in two ways. One, domestic violence. And so in the survey, some of you may have seen this little blurb that describes the prevalence of domestic violence in the country of El Salvador. Others of you may have seen this blurb, which corresponds to drug-related violence. Both of these statements are true. There's no deception here. These are two common reasons why migrants choose to leave, flee, exit El Salvador. The second question is, suppose that we contextualize migration in terms of gender. So in my study, some of you may have learned about a migrant named Maria Lopez. And in the context of the reasons for why someone might leave, we added in this additional sentence, and some of you may have seen this. Because of the threat and risk posed by domestic violence, many Salvadorans have had to leave, including Maria Lopez. Others of you, and you would have seen the same thing if you were exposed to the drug-related violence context. We also, some of you may have been exposed to a migrant named Miguel Lopez. And just as we did with Maria, we contextualize why Miguel Lopez had to leave El Salvador. And that contextualization was due to either threats posed by domestic violence or by drug-related violence. So at this point, we have two reasons why a migrant might leave: domestic or drug-related violence, and we have two genders, Maria or Miguel. Thirdly, we ask this question: suppose we contextualize the reason Lopez was deported. In other words, what happened that prompted Lopez's deportation? In all of the experimental conditions, all of you would have learned that this migrant named Lopez was apprehended in an immigration raid. And so many of you, or all of you, would have seen this bit of text pop up on your screen, where in the Maria Lopez condition, we're told that she came from El Salvador. We're told that she illegally entered the US. We're told that she was arrested in a workplace raid, and we're told that she was put in detention and then later deported to El Salvador. This is the same condition, but substituting in Miguel. So you can see what we're doing here. We're taking similar conditions and juxtaposing it by gender. Now, why do we choose an immigration raid? In a previous study that I'm working on currently, one thing we did was we were interested in looking at different degrees of legal infractions. And so in a previous study, I compared, say, an immigration raid to a drunk driving incident. In this case, in this study, in your survey, we decided to hold the infraction constant. That is, keep it the same for everybody. And so we chose an immigration raid for the following reason, three reasons. One, it's a common way that migrants are apprehended. Two, it is largely a victimless infraction. That is, no Americans are injured or hurt by way of an immigration raid. And three, it's a common reason why immigrants ultimately get deported. So we chose this relatively low-level infraction as a basis for deportation. Then lastly, we contextualize in the study what happened to Lopez after he or she was deported. That is, we provide information in some conditions that Lopez, after deportation, was found murdered by the Salvadoran police. And so some of you may have seen this text here, where in this case, where we learned that Maria Lopez was shot to death by a family member, and that her death was attributed to domestic violence. And in another condition, you may have learned that she was killed in in a context of drug-related violence. And here again, we would have juxtaposed Maria with Miguel, depending on which gender condition in the experiment you were exposed to. So why did we choose murder? Well, we reasoned this. Murder is probably the most extreme negative outcome that can take place as a result of deportation. It's also, I'm not going to say it is common, because it's not. We've deported millions of people, and most of them don't get murdered. However, it's not uncommon in some contexts for something as drastic as murder of the deportee to take place. We also chose the outcome of murder because it is the most extreme. And if we don't observe any differences when people learn that Lopez was murdered compared to people who don't learn that Lopez is murdered, then any other less drastic outcome probably won't yield any differences either. So in a research setting, you've got to start somewhere. You've got to make some assumptions and pin them down, or make some choices and pin them down and go from there. So let's put these pieces together. And the question is, what did you, as a UC Davis student taking this survey for extra credit, what did you see when you took the survey? Well, it depends. It depends on how you were randomized into the study. And so here we use what's known as an experimental design. And most all experimental designs involve some sort of randomization. So think about like a drug trial, like a vaccine trial, where some people are actually given the vaccine and some people are given what's known as a placebo vaccine, right? And so and people are randomized to either get the actual drug or not get the actual drug. Well, we're doing something similar to that, albeit with information, not with drugs. So one condition that you may have been exposed to, and you were only exposed to one, would have been learning that the migrant is female, Maria, and learning that she left El Salvador because of domestic violence. What do you not learn in this one? You don't learn what happened to her. You don't learn that she died. The only thing that you learn is domestic violence is a problem in El Salvador. Maria left and she was apprehended in an immigration raid and then deported. In another condition, you would have learned the same exact information as on the previous slide, except that instead of Maria, you were exposed to Miguel. Then another condition adds additional information. That is, you learn in this case that Maria left because of domestic violence, that she was apprehended in an immigration raid and deported, but then you're given the additional information that after removal, deportation, she was found murdered. So we call this the Maria plus domestic violence plus death condition. Condition 2B, again, is the exact same thing as before, as the previous slide, except that we substitute Miguel in instead of Maria. Now, condition 3A is the condition where you learn that Maria, that you learn that drug violence is prevalent in El Salvador, that she left because of drug violence, that she was apprehended in an immigration raid and deported. What you don't learn, again, is what happened to her after removal. Condition 3B is just like 3A, except that we have Miguel here instead of Maria. Then lastly, conditions 4A and 4B add the additional information that after removal, Maria or Miguel was found murdered and their death was attributed to drug-related violence. And so this is 4B, it's the same as 4A, except that we substituted Miguel. So we have a research design now. And what we have is what's known as a 2 by 2 by 2 factorial design. Now, where does that stuff come from? Take my Pol 51 class and you'll learn, but you're not in my Pol 51 class. So what is 2 by 2 by 2? Well, each of the twos means something. Here, we have two reasons for immigration. That is, you left because of domestic violence or because of drug violence. We have a 2-gender condition, male or female, Maria or Miguel. And we have 2 information conditions. In one condition, no death information is given. In the second condition, we provide that information to you. So 2 times 2 times 2 equals 8. So this means that for most of you, you were randomized to one and only one of 8 possible conditions. But some of you may be sitting there and saying to yourself, wait a minute, I didn't see that. I saw something else. Well, what we did is we included what's known as a control condition. And in the control condition, for some of you, you were given no contextualizing information about why people migrate, and you were given no information about Lopez's death. Instead, you may have seen something like this. The operative paragraph is this one up top here, where you're just given neutral information about the country of El Salvador. We call this neutral because it doesn't force you or prod you to think about violence, domestic or drug or any other sorts of violence, right? And so why do we do this? Well, here's why. If we want to understand how contextualizing information affects attitudes, then sometimes it's useful to be able to compare that to a condition where people are not given that information. And so that's what the control condition is doing. Similarly, if we're interested in how information about Lopez's death affects judgment, then having a condition where you don't learn about it is also important. So if we take these 2 conditions here, this is that neutral control condition for Maria, and this is that one for Miguel, then we have a total of 10 possible experimental conditions you could have been exposed to. But you were only exposed to one of them. All right, so based on this, then we can come up with a number of research expectations or hypotheses. And in this study, we're interested in several, and I'll outline them for you. First of all, what's a hypothesis? Here it is. It's just a statement about how you think the world works. And so in my case, I'm interested in hypothesizing the impact of contextualizing information, that is the reasons why migrants leave, as well as death information, that is the information about what happens to the deportee after removal. So in true social science form, we give these hypotheses names. So I'm going to call this one the context hypothesis. And this is a statement of how I think the world works. When people learn there are structural reasons why immigrants leave their country, support for deportation will decrease, as well as the tendency to blame the immigrant for her or his fate will also decrease. Why do I expect this? Well, I expect that contextualizing information truly does provide a more holistic picture of the immigration process. And so when people come to learn that, hey, there are real reasons why this person had to leave, then that likely has the impact of lowering support for removal. That's the basis of that hypothesis. A related hypothesis is what I call the violence hypothesis. And this one in this study is mostly exploratory. And the hypothesis goes like this. Levels of support and blame will differ depending on the reason for immigrating. And so there could be differences when you learn about a drug-related violence. We learn about drug-related violence versus domestic-related violence. But ex ante, that is before the fact, I don't have a strong prediction as to which one will have a bigger effect on attitudes. The third hypothesis I call the death hypothesis, and that is quite simple. When people learn that the person was murdered after deportation, support for deportation will decrease, and the tendency to blame the immigrant for her or his fate will also decrease. The expectation is this. The immigrant was picked up for a very low-grade infraction, caught in an immigration raid. But in so doing and so being deported, the migrant ended up being murdered. We expect that this extreme outcome that is premised on a relatively low-level infraction will likely lead people to think that to elicit lower levels of support for deportation. And then the last hypothesis we call the gender hypothesis, and it goes like this. when people are exposed to the Maria condition, support for deportation will be lower, and the tendency to blame the immigrant for her fate will be lower compared to those who are exposed to the Miguel condition. So we expect people, when exposed to a female migrant, will lower their levels of support and blame compared to the male gender condition. So given these hypotheses, we can make a pretty clear prediction of who should have the lowest level of support for deportation and the lowest level of immigrant blaming, as well as the highest. So if you are exposed to a contextual cue, either a drug-related or domestic violence condition, coupled with the fact that the migrant was female, coupled with, added to the fact that you learned that the female migrant died, then this leads us to predict that this is going to be the condition that's going to have the lowest level of support for deportation. Why? Well, you take each of these three things individually, and we predict that all three of them should reduce support for deportation. Therefore, when you put them all three together, this should have the lowest level of support compared to any other experimental condition. The highest should be in the no contextual cue, that is when you're given no information about why immigrants leave El Salvador, and you're exposed to the male gender condition. Why do we expect this to elicit the highest level of support? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, there's no contextualizing information given, so you don't learn that there's a problem in El Salvador that's prompting Miguel to leave. You would have to infer that yourself. And then second, our prediction is that male gender will elicit higher levels of support compared to the female gender. So you put those two things together, and that leads to the prediction that this will have the highest level of support for removal. So we're almost done here. So after you read all of this stuff about Lopez, then you answered a bunch of survey questions, a bunch of outcome measures. And some of those outcome measures dealt with support for Lopez's removal, as well as perceived justness and fairness of Lopez's removal, as well as blame attribution questions. That is, who's most to blame for what happened to Lopez? And I like the concept of blame because there's two ways to think about blame. One, we might call dispositional blame. I call that, another way to call that is victim blaming. You blame the victim for what happened to him or her or them. Versus situational blaming. That is, you blame the context, you blame the extant circumstances for what actually happened. So the analogy I like to use is, why do we have a homeless problem? The dispositional blamer will say, well, it's the homeless person's fault that they're homeless. They're lazy. They don't do enough work. If they just worked harder, they wouldn't be homeless. The situational blamer might say, well, income inequality, coupled with, the prevalence of drug addiction, mental health disparities, whatnot, leads to the chronic problem of homelessness. Now, the reason why we care about blame attribution is that depending on kind of which side of the coin you choose to blame something, that likely affects the kinds of policies you think should be implemented to remedy the problem at hand. So the specific questions you answered, and all of you would have answered these questions, is the first one was, do you support or oppose the decision to remove Lopez, Miguel, or Maria? If you were in the Miguel condition, you only ever saw Miguel. If you were in the Maria condition, you only ever saw female pronouns and the word Maria. Then you answered a couple of other questions. One dealt with whether or not you thought that Lopez was treated fairly, or whether or not you think Lopez got what he or she deserved. In our analysis, what we're going to do is we're going to combine these two questions into what's known as a scale. I've done this before, but we're going to just combine the information in these two questions since they deal with similar issues. Thirdly, you answered a question about blame attribution. So you answered the question, of the following, which is the most likely to blame for what happened to Lopez? So you were given the option of blaming Lopez himself, the US immigration system, El Salvador's government, drug-related violence, or domestic violence. And so you could be a victim blamer or a dispositional blamer if you chose number one, and maybe a situational blamer if you chose 2, 3, 4, or 5. But of course, it could be that multiple things are at fault. And so we asked the final question where you allocated a weight to each one of these things. And so the weight would add up to effectively 100%. And so from this, we can determine how you ascribe blame over a bunch of potential explanations for what happened. Lastly, we had one additional outcome. And this idea came to me from an audience member at a presentation that I did. And or it's an adaptation of an idea. And essentially what we ask is, what do you think happened to Lopez? Now remember, not all of you learned about Lopez's death. So we just asked this question to everybody. We asked a question like this: many things can happen to people after they are deported. Based on what you've read about Maria Lopez, or Miguel if you're in the Miguel condition, what do you think the chances are that any of the following took place after her return? And so we allowed you to assign weights to these different outcomes here. So Lopez might have been murdered. Lopez might have been violently attacked. Lopez safely rejoined society. Lopez attempted to re-enter the US. Lopez lived a life in poverty. And Lopez realized that he was happy. He or she was happy in El Salvador. Right. So that allows us to kind of get into your head what you think might have actually taken place. And we're particularly interested in this question for those who didn't learn about Lopez's death. There's other features of the survey. You ask a bunch of questions that are based on some psychological scales, including one known as system justifying beliefs. So there was a survey question in there as a part of the scale, and the question went something like this: I think the US is the greatest country in the world to live in. You could have agreed or disagreed. Had a number of questions kind of similar to that. What we do is we combine those questions together, and that forms what's a scale that's known as system justifying beliefs. We also ask a series of, I believe, 8 or 12 questions that deal with what are known as individualizing values. And these questions really dealt with perceptions of what is fair and what constitutes harm. And so one of the example questions in this, you may recall, would be a question that said, it is always wrong to kill a human being, or something along those lines. Additionally, we ask you about your party affiliation. Since you're all UC Davis undergraduate students, most of you haven't looked at the data yet, but most of you will identify as either independent or Democratic, which is unfortunate from the perspective of wanting to have variation. But this is where we're starting this study, and we would do a follow-up with a different sample to ensure that we get and can measure the attitudes of more conservative individuals, which is extraordinarily important to understand. We also asked some standard demographics. You also had the opportunity to provide what are known as open-ended responses, of which many of you did. So we asked the question, previously you said Lopez was most to blame, why? Or previously you said you supported Lopez's removal, why? Or you opposed it, why? And so these what's known as open-ended responses. These are hard data to analyze, but I know how to do it. And that'll come a little bit later. Then lastly, we asked a bunch of questions about support or opposition for different kinds of immigration policies. For example, should we increase the number of Border Patrol agents? Should we have a guest worker program? This, that, and the other. Okay, so let's raise a few issues. Some of you may have taken a similar version of the study before. Earlier, I mentioned that I had done something like this. Like last winter, I think it was. And so in the survey, I asked a question: did you take this survey or something like this in the past? And I'm sorry to say that if you said you probably did or you definitely did, then I'm going to take your data and eliminate it. Mind you, you're going to get your extra credit, but I can't use your data because having been exposed to a prior version of this might affect how you answered this question. So I just eliminate those responses automatically. The second issue is, and some of you watching this, actually, if you're watching this, you're probably not in this category here, but in online surveys, there's a problem known as speeding. That is, people who and straight lining. That is people who just click the first answer and to get through the survey as fast as possible. Guess what? If you did that, you won't be included in the analysis because if you do that, if someone does that, they contaminate the data because there's no possible way they're reading the survey questions. So we time every question, how long it takes for someone to answer the question. And then based on that, I have a method to determine who the likely speeders are. And then what I do is I omit them from the analysis. Okay, so in terms of analyzing these data, we're going to apply a statistical technique that you may know or may have learned about in Poll 51, known as regression analysis, to analyze these outcomes. We're going to use the statistical programming language called R to do most of the work. And when I present results, I rely heavily on visual displays of the outcomes. Okay, so this is my last slide here. And one thing I want to do is thank you. Thank you for the participation in these studies, not just me, but any of these studies that you take part in during your career at UC Davis. It's crucial that you do this, and not just because it helps me to get some research done, but it also, especially when you view this and you get a better idea as to what it is that you have done, it gives you experience on the other side of the research ledger, so to speak. That is, you're participating and providing important information to understand an important policy issue called deportation. So I am quite grateful for you taking the time to do this. If you have any questions, you can email me. This is my email address. And lastly, if you want a copy of the write-up, you can email me, but don't expect anything soon. It takes a long time to clean up these data, analyze them, so forth and so on. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and say thank you very much. If you watch this on super fast time, and then you'll be done. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.